In every town, there's always someone you trust without hesitation. A figure of authority, someone who represents safety, someone you believe will always do the right thing. But what happens when that trust is shattered? What happens when the one you look to for protection becomes the very thing you fear? In Maple Ridge, life felt ordinary. Children laughed as they played in the streets, neighbors shared warm smiles and friendly waves, and the days passed as they always had. But under the surface of this seemingly perfect town, a dark truth was beginning to emerge, one that would tear apart the fabric of everything they thought they knew. What do you do when the person you trust most, the one bound by duty to serve and protect, harbors a secret that could destroy it all? At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He was a sheriff, a father, a husband. She was a bright young girl with her whole life ahead of her. Their lives intersected, as they often did in Maple Ridge. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Conversations that began casually grew longer. Private moments, once innocent, became something more. And before anyone could see it coming, a line was crossed, a line that could never be uncrossed. Sheriff Ethan Carter was more than just the man in uniform. He was the backbone of Maple Ridge, trusted by neighbors, respected by colleagues, and admired by his family. To most, Ethan was the man who flawlessly balanced the weight of law enforcement with the demands of being a husband and father. Married to Charlotte, with 2 daughters, he seemed to live the life everyone aspired to, a man who had it all. His youngest daughter, Sophie, adored him. To Sophie, her father wasn't just the sheriff. He was her hero, the unwavering foundation of their family. Sophie's best friend, Rachel Andrews, had practically grown up in the Carter household. From playing in the backyard as toddlers to sharing late-night study sessions, Sophie and Rachel were inseparable, the kind of friends who didn't knock before walking through the door. Rachel was family in everything but name. But Rachel wasn't just Sophie's best friend. She was the daughter of Officer Daniel Andrews, Ethan's deputy and closest confidant. The bond between their families had been built over years of shared trust and loyalty. Barbecues, holidays, and summer vacations, every milestone seemed to include them both. Ethan had watched Rachel grow up, his presence in her life as steady as the passing seasons. He remembered the day she was born as clearly as if it were yesterday. He had held her in his arms and promised Daniel that he would always look out for her. But now, Rachel was 17. She was no longer the little girl Ethan had once carried on his shoulders. She was stepping into adulthood, driven by ambition and a sense of purpose. Rachel dreamed of a future in law enforcement, inspired by her late grandfather. She wanted to make a name for herself, to one day join the ranks of the FBI or Secret Service. She was confident, determined, and focused. The lives of the Carters and the Andrews families, bound together by trust and shared history, were standing on the brink of an unseen shift, one that no one could have anticipated. Ethan saw her more frequently now, not just as Sophie's best friend, but as someone who seemed to always be nearby. She was in his house almost every weekend. They crossed paths at family parties, school events, and occasionally at the sheriff's office when Rachel stopped by to meet her father, Officer Daniel Andrews. She was always around, always present in the backdrop of Ethan's life. And with every passing day, their lives became just a little more intertwined. It started like any other day, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of day that should have faded into the rhythm of routine. But some moments have a way of changing everything, and this was one of those moments. Rachel hadn't planned on staying long at the sheriff's office. She only stopped by to meet her father, hoping for a quick hello and a ride home. She had done it countless times before, waiting in the lobby, surrounded by the hum of conversations and the steady ring of phones. It was familiar, uneventful. But this afternoon felt different. Ethan Carter spotted her from his office window as she entered the building. Her presence caught his attention in a way it never had before. She wasn't the same girl he remembered. The shadow of adolescence had been replaced by the undeniable presence of a young woman. There was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself now, something he hadn't noticed before. Ethan told himself it was nothing, just an observation. But the thought lingered longer than it should have. He knew Rachel well, too well. He had watched her grow up, laughed at her childhood antics and celebrated her achievements alongside his daughter Sophie. But today, something was different. Something stirred within him, a shift he didn't want to acknowledge. He tried to push it aside, reminding himself of who she was, who he was. But the more he watched her, the harder it became to look away. She wasn't just Rachel, the girl from summers in the backyard and shared family dinners. She was someone else now, someone he found himself noticing in a way he shouldn't. The moment unsettled him like stepping on unstable ground. Guilt began to creep into his thoughts, whispering warnings he didn't want to hear. But temptation has a way of slipping through cracks, winding its way into even the most disciplined mind. And as much as he tried to push it away, the feeling clung to him, persistent and unwelcome. When Rachel made her way down the hall toward her father's desk, Ethan stepped out of his office almost instinctively. He knew Daniel was out on assignment. He had sent him himself. There was no one else for Rachel to meet, no one else to sit with. And in that moment, Ethan saw an opportunity, a chance to prolong this encounter, to indulge in a curiosity he couldn't admit even to himself. "Rachel," he called out, his tone casual, easy, almost fatherly. "Your dad's not back yet. Why don't you come wait in my office?" There was nothing in his voice to raise suspicion, no reason for Rachel to feel uneasy. She smiled easily, trusting him completely. He was, after all, her father's closest friend, someone she had known her entire life. Without hesitation, she followed him into the office she had seen so many times before. Ethan gestured for her to sit by the window, watching as she settled into the chair. Her gaze wandered, taking in the framed commendations, mementos, and photographs on the shelves, evidence of years spent in law enforcement. The room, like the man himself, radiated authority and experience. Rachel admired it with a sense of wonder, unaware of the thoughts unraveling in Ethan's mind. He tried to act normal, tried to tell himself that this was just another conversation, just another day. But as he sat across from her, something inside him refused to quiet. She wasn't just a visitor in his office. She was a young woman, sitting within reach, someone who, for the first time in years, made him feel something he didn't expect. He asked her about school, a safe topic, familiar territory, and Rachel, comfortable in his presence, responded eagerly. She talked about her classes, her friends, and the future she envisioned for herself. "I've been thinking about going into law enforcement," she said, her voice alive with excitement. "Maybe as a detective or even in the Secret Service, something that really matters." Ethan listened, his focus entirely on her. There was a passion in her words, a spark of ambition that reminded him of his own younger days. In that moment, he saw an opportunity, a chance to position himself as a guide, someone who could help her shape her future. The idea came without warning, a way to extend their conversations beyond this room, to ensure these moments didn't end here. "You know," Ethan said slowly, "I have some friends in those agencies. I could put in a good word for you, maybe even help you get some hands-on experience." Rachel's eyes lit up. "Really? You'd do that for me?" He smiled, the perfect image of a mentor offering support. "Of course, but it's not an easy path. There's a lot to learn before you get there, and you'll need to work hard. If you want, I could help you prepare." There was nothing in his tone that suggested anything other than kindness, and Rachel, eager to succeed, didn't hesitate. Why would she? To her, he was just a respected, experienced man offering his guidance, someone she trusted completely. Ethan leaned back in his chair, pleased with how easily the conversation had unfolded, how naturally he had laid the groundwork for future encounters. He told himself it was harmless, that he was simply helping a young woman pursue her dreams. But deep down, he knew better. Every word he had spoken, every promise he had made, was part of something far more complicated. As Rachel sat across from him, bright with hope for the opportunities ahead, Ethan allowed himself a fleeting moment to revel in the power he held. The power to influence her dreams, to shape her path, and, if he chose, to take these meetings somewhere she could never anticipate. In that moment, he crossed a line that could never be undone. Rachel had sensed something was wrong for weeks. At first, she dismissed it, convincing herself it was just stress or exhaustion. But as the days passed, the signs became impossible to ignore. The nausea each morning, the sudden fatigue, the undeniable feeling that something had changed within her. Eventually, she bought a pregnancy test, hoping, praying that it was all in her imagination. But when the 2 lines appeared, confirming her worst fear, the ground beneath her seemed to vanish. She stared at the test in disbelief, her heart pounding as 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. She wasn't prepared for this. She hadn't planned for this. And yet, there it was, the undeniable proof that life had taken an unexpected and irreversible turn. For hours, she sat in silence, the weight of the realization pressing down on her. Amid the chaos of her thoughts, one thing became clear. She had to tell Ethan. He had promised to support her, to help her build her future. If anyone could help her navigate this, it would be him, wouldn't it? When Rachel finally gathered the courage to tell him, it was during one of their late-night conversations. They sat together, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. She knew that once she spoke, everything would change. There would be no turning back. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" he asked, leaning in, bracing himself for what was coming. Rachel hesitated, her hands shaking. Finally, the words tumbled out before she could stop herself. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Ethan stared at her, his expression frozen in disbelief. The words hung in the air like a ticking clock, each second stretching into eternity. Panic surged through him. His mind raced with the implications, what this meant for his career, his family, his reputation. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built was now at risk. If anyone found out, his wife, his daughters, the town, his life would be over. Ethan felt the walls closing in, the weight of his double life crushing him. He needed a solution, something quick, something final. This couldn't come out. It wouldn't come out. "This can't happen," he said, his voice sharp, almost panicked. "No one can know." Rachel stared at him, confusion and hurt clouding her face. "What do you mean? We can figure this out. You said you'd always be there for me." He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts spiraling. He couldn't afford this scandal. He couldn't handle the fallout. In his desperation, a single thought emerged. There was still time to fix this. There was still time to make it go away. "You need to get rid of it," he said urgently. "This has to end before it's too late." Rachel's heart sank, disbelief washing over her. She had come to him for support, for reassurance, but instead she was met with fear and rejection. "You're asking me to have an abortion?" she whispered, her voice cracking. He nodded, desperation etched into every line of his face. "It's the only way," he insisted. "If anyone finds out, my wife, your father, everything will be ruined. We can't let that happen. Please, Rachel, you have to do this." But Rachel shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No," she said firmly, "I won't do that. This is our child, Ethan. You told me we were in this together. You promised." For the first time, Ethan realized that Rachel believed the fantasy he had created, that their relationship was real, that they had a future. And in that moment, he felt the full weight of his manipulation. She wasn't just carrying his child, she was carrying every lie he had told her, every promise he had made to keep her close. His panic deepened. He tried again to reason with her, to make her understand the danger they were in. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "If this gets out, my career is over. My family, my life, everything will be destroyed. We can't let that happen, Rachel. You have to do this." But Rachel's resolve remained unshaken. She shook her head again, her voice steady even as tears streamed down her face. "I won't do it," she said softly but firmly. "This is my child, and I won't let you make me feel ashamed for wanting to keep it." Ethan felt the ground slipping beneath him, his control over the situation unraveling with every word she spoke. His life, built on careful control over his career, his family, and his relationships, was crumbling. And now, in the face of Rachel's quiet defiance, his grasp on that control was slipping away. For the first time, Ethan Carter, the man the town saw as composed, steady, and in control, felt powerless, and that terrified him. He made one final plea, his voice breaking under the weight of his desperation. "Please, Rachel," he whispered. "If you care about me, about us, you'll do this. You'll end it before it's too late." But Rachel met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "No," she said simply, "I'm keeping it." And in that moment, Ethan knew his carefully constructed life, the one he had fought so hard to protect, was on the verge of collapsing. There was no turning back now. The truth was out. and no matter how hard he tried, the consequences of his choices were closing in. There comes a point where fear consumes everything, logic fades, morality crumbles, and all that remains is the instinct to survive, no matter the cost. For Ethan, that moment had arrived. With each passing day, the walls of his carefully constructed life were closing in, and the truth loomed like a shadow, ready to destroy him. The pregnancy was a threat Ethan couldn't escape. No amount of lies or persuasion had worked. Rachel had made it clear she wasn't going to terminate the pregnancy, and with that decision, Ethan's world began to unravel. His career, his marriage, his reputation, everything he had built was now teetering on the edge of collapse. If the truth came out, there would be no redemption. His name would be dragged through the mud. The sheriff's office would be destroyed by scandal. Charlotte would leave him. His daughters would disown him. And the town that once admired him would turn against him with fury. Ethan saw no way out, no way to contain the damage. Then a thought crept in, one that should have horrified him, but instead brought a twisted sense of clarity. There was one way, one final way, to ensure the truth never saw the light of day. He told himself it was the only solution. It was no longer about right or wrong. It was about survival. The plan formed slowly, taking root in the darkest corners of his mind. If Rachel disappeared, no one would ever know. Questions could be managed. He was the sheriff, after all. He could control the investigation, steer it away from the truth, and ensure no one ever connected the dots. He waited for the right moment. Calmly, and with reassurance, he invited Rachel to meet him for dinner at a secluded cabin. He framed it as a chance to talk about the future, to plan for the baby, to figure out how they could make things work. Despite everything, Rachel wanted to believe him. She clung to the hope that Ethan would keep his promises, that they could find a way forward together. She arrived at the cabin, far from prying eyes, greeted by Ethan's familiar smile and comforting presence. He had prepared meticulously, a quiet dinner, just the two of them, wine poured into delicate glasses and a fire crackling warmly in the background. They talked, their conversation filled with promises and reassurances. Ethan told her everything she wanted to hear, that they could figure it out, that everything would be okay. For a brief moment, Rachel believed him. She let her guard down, drawn in by the man she thought she knew. But Ethan's mind was elsewhere. His focus was on the small vial hidden in his pocket, a vial that would ensure Rachel could never speak of the secret they shared. As Rachel picked at her dinner, Ethan leaned in, offering to refill her glass. With practiced ease, he poured the wine, palming the vial as he did. The contents dissolved seamlessly into the glass. When he handed it back, his voice was smooth, his demeanor calm. "This should help us relax a little," he said with a smile. Rachel, trusting and unaware, took a sip. Then another. The wine flowed easily as their conversation continued, but it didn't take long for the drug to take effect. Her eyelids grew heavy, her words slurred. Confusion washed over her as she looked at Ethan, trying to understand what was happening. "I don't feel so good," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan reached out, resting his hand on hers in a gesture of false comfort. "It's okay," he said softly. "You just need to rest. Everything's going to be fine." Rachel's body went limp, her head lolling to the side as the drug pulled her into unconsciousness. Ethan watched her closely, ensuring the drug had done its job. Then, without hesitation, he moved to the next phase of his plan. He carried her to his truck, her lifeless form cradled in his arms. The drive was long, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him with every mile. He had chosen the location carefully, a remote clearing deep in the woods, far from any trails. It was a place where secrets could stay buried. When he reached the clearing, he stepped out, ensuring they were alone. The forest stood silent, the trees like mute witnesses. He carried Rachel deep into the woods, his steps slow and deliberate. And there, in that isolated place, Ethan did what he had convinced himself was necessary. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he placed them over her mouth and nose. Rachel stirred briefly, her body reacting instinctively, but the drug was too strong. Within moments, the struggle stopped, and the forest fell silent once more. Ethan sat motionless for a moment, his hands still pressed against her lifeless face. Then, as if on autopilot, he began to dig. The dirt flew beneath his hands as he created a shallow grave, the weight of his actions crushing him. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. When the grave was complete, he laid Rachel's body inside, covering her with the cold, damp earth. And just like that, she was gone, buried beneath the lies and betrayal that had brought them to this moment. Ethan stood over the grave, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The night was still, the forest holding its breath as if waiting to see what he would do next. But there was nothing left to do. He had made his choice. Without a word, Ethan turned and walked back to his truck, leaving no trace of what had transpired. The forest would keep his secret, and with it, the life he was so desperate to protect. When someone goes missing in a close-knit town, it sends shockwaves through the community. People rally together, neighbors exchange worried glances, and families hold each other a little tighter, hoping it never happens to them. But this time, the missing person wasn't just anyone. This was Rachel Andrews, the daughter of a beloved officer, a girl everyone knew and adored. The day Rachel didn't come home, panic began to spread. Her parents, Daniel and Linda Andrews, went from assuming she was running late to realizing something was terribly wrong. They tried calling her phone. No answer. They contacted her friends. None of them had seen her. As the hours passed without a word from Rachel, fear began to set in, cold and relentless. Daniel's gut told him something wasn't right. His instincts as a father and an officer left him uneasy. Rachel wasn't the kind of girl to disappear without telling someone where she was going. And when night fell with no sign of her, Daniel did the only thing he could. He filed a missing persons report. The sheriff's office sprang into action, or at least it appeared that way. Leading the search was Sheriff Ethan Carter, the man who had every reason to ensure Rachel was never found. Ethan wore the mask of professionalism perfectly, his voice steady, his demeanor calm, as he promised the community that he would do everything in his power to bring Rachel home. But every step Ethan took was calculated. Every lead followed, every search organized was done with a singular goal: to keep the truth buried along with Rachel. Deputies canvassed the town, questioning anyone who might have seen her. Ethan ensured that every effort appeared genuine. Teams scoured parks, abandoned buildings, and back roads. He was there every step of the way, giving orders, comforting volunteers, and appearing to go above and beyond. To everyone else, he looked like a man determined to find the missing girl. But behind the scenes, Ethan carefully steered the investigation away from the one place they would never look: the remote clearing in Pinecrest Woods, where Rachel's body lay hidden beneath the earth. Daniel, desperate for answers, leaned heavily on Ethan, his closest friend and mentor. Ethan played the part perfectly, offering comfort and support, staying close to the family, and ensuring they believed he was doing everything in his power to find Rachel. "We'll find her, Daniel," he said repeatedly, his tone steady and reassuring. "I promise you, we'll bring her home." Each time Daniel's hope began to waver, Ethan was there to catch him. He visited the Andrews home frequently, sitting at their kitchen table, holding Linda's hand while she cried, and becoming their lifeline in the chaos. But Ethan's control over the investigation was absolute. He carefully guided deputies toward false leads, planting theories that Rachel might have left town overwhelmed by stress, or stayed with a friend who hadn't come forward yet. Each theory was designed to sow doubt, redirecting attention toward dead ends. Every time the search team approached an area that brought them too close to the truth, Ethan found a way to divert them: a sighting on the other side of town, a tip that needed immediate attention elsewhere. He kept everyone moving, always one step behind where they needed to be. Meanwhile, Daniel and Linda clung to Ethan's every word, convinced he was working tirelessly to bring their daughter home. Daniel, especially, relied on Ethan more than anyone. As a father and a deputy, he felt helpless. But with Ethan leading the charge, he held on to hope, a belief that his longtime friend would find Rachel. Ethan skillfully manipulated that trust, keeping Daniel close while hiding the truth. He included Daniel in the investigation just enough to make him feel involved, but never enough to uncover the lies. When Daniel's frustration boiled over, Ethan absorbed it, offering sympathy and reassurance. "I should have been there," Daniel said more than once, guilt and grief in his voice. "I should have protected her." Ethan would shake his head solemnly. This isn't your fault, Daniel. We'll find her. I promise you, we'll find her. It was a perfect manipulation, a delicate balance of empathy and deceit. Ethan gave the Andrews family just enough hope to keep them going, just enough comfort to keep them from looking too closely at the gaps in the investigation. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Rachel. The community grew restless, rumors spread like wildfire, and whispered theories filled the air. Some believed she had run away. Others feared something far worse. Through it all, Ethan remained the steady, trusted presence everyone turned to for answers. But behind the scenes, the weight of his actions began to take its toll. Each day the search dragged on was a reminder of the terrible truth he was hiding. And though he wore the mask of a concerned sheriff, well, cracks began to show. Moments when the guilt gnawed at his mind, threatening to unravel the carefully constructed lie he had built. But Ethan couldn't afford to falter. The moment he slipped, everything would come crashing down. So he kept moving forward, directing the search, feeding the Andrews family just enough hope to prevent them from giving up. Time was on his side. The longer the search went on without results, the more likely the town would begin to believe Rachel was gone for good. And if the investigation dragged on long enough, it would eventually fade into the background, just another unsolved case, another tragedy without answers. That was Ethan's hope, that the search would lose momentum, that the town would move on, and that his secret would remain buried where no one would ever find it. But secrets have a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deeply they're buried. As the days passed, the pressure on Ethan grew heavier, and the cracks in his carefully constructed world spread wider with every passing moment. The investigation he had worked so hard to control was slipping out of his grasp. The harder he tried to contain it, the more fragile it became. And then, the breakthrough came. Not from the detectives or the community, but from an unexpected source. Two hikers, out for what they thought would be a peaceful day on the trails, stumbled onto something they couldn't ignore. They had ventured deep into Pinecrest Woods, a dense and isolated area rarely visited except by the most adventurous. The winding trail was surrounded by thick trees and silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves. It was the kind of place where no one would expect to find anything but nature, much less a hidden secret. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the forest, the hikers noticed something unusual, a patch of ground that looked disturbed, uneven, and slightly sunken. They exchanged uneasy glances. It could have been nothing, a buried animal, maybe, but something about it felt wrong. Their curiosity got the better of them, and they stepped closer. One knelt down for a closer look. That's when they saw it. A small corner of fabric, barely visible beneath the dirt and leaves. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a chill through them. They didn't disturb the site further. Instead, they marked the location with their GPS and quickly made their way to the nearest ranger station, their hearts pounding with fear and disbelief. The rangers, alerted to the hikers' discovery, contacted local authorities. Within hours, an investigative team was on site. What they uncovered beneath the disturbed earth confirmed the hikers' worst fears. Rachel Andrews' body, carefully wrapped in a tarp, lay buried in a shallow grave. Her remains told a silent, devastating story of betrayal and violence. The discovery didn't just provide the location of her body. It raised questions that demanded answers. How had Rachel ended up there? And, most importantly, who had put her there? As the forensic team worked methodically, law enforcement combed the surrounding area for clues. Among the dirt and foliage, they found the first critical piece of evidence, a small vial, partially buried and marked with a faint fingerprint. It was a seemingly insignificant object, but one that would later prove vital to the case. With Rachel's body recovered, the investigation reignited. Detectives took over, determined to piece together the truth of her disappearance. They retraced Rachel's final movements, pulling GPS data from her phone. What they found began to unravel the lies Ethan had carefully constructed. The data revealed a troubling pattern. Rachel's phone had pinged from locations far from where Ethan had claimed she was last seen. One of those locations was a remote gas station outside of town, a place that would become a cornerstone of the case. Surveillance footage from the gas station revealed the full extent of Ethan's deception. The grainy video, recorded the night Rachel disappeared, showed Ethan's truck pulling into the lot. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if ensuring no one was watching. In the passenger seat, slumped and unmoving, was Rachel. Her head rested against the window, her body limp. Ethan stepped out of the truck briefly, glancing back toward Rachel before re-entering the vehicle. Seconds later, he drove off into the night, the truck disappearing from view and from the town's collective memory. The footage was damning. It didn't just place Ethan with Rachel on the night she vanished. It showed her in a vulnerable, unconscious state, in the company of the man who was supposed to protect her. The questions were immediate and unavoidable. Why hadn't Ethan mentioned being with Rachel that night? Why had he omitted this encounter from his statements? And most importantly, what had really happened after they left the gas station? As detectives pieced together Rachel's movements and linked them to the burial site, Ethan's carefully built facade began to crumble. But they needed more than suspicions. They needed hard evidence. The key to unlocking that evidence lay in the digital trail left by Ethan's truck. GPS data from Ethan's vehicle, pulled from its onboard tracking system, provided the final piece of the puzzle. The logs confirmed what the surveillance footage suggested. Ethan's truck had traveled from the gas station to the remote area where Rachel's body was found. The route matched exactly with the location marked by the hikers. Every stop, every turn was accounted for, painting a chilling picture of premeditation and cover-up. It was a trail Ethan hadn't expected anyone to follow. But no matter how carefully he had tried to conceal his actions, the truth had found a way to surface. First through the hikers, and then through the relentless work of investigators determined to uncover the lies buried beneath the surface. The discovery of Rachel Andrews' body wasn't just the end of a search, it was the beginning of justice. And those hikers, unaware of the storm they were about to unleash, had uncovered the secret Ethan Carter thought he had buried forever. As the investigation gained momentum, the truth about Ethan's betrayal spread through the town like wildfire. His carefully constructed facade of authority crumbled under the weight of the evidence. With each new revelation, the community began to grasp the depth of his deception and the horrific cost Rachel paid for his abuse of power. The hikers' discovery in Pinecrest Woods became the turning point in a case that had lingered unresolved for far too long. As the town braced for the storm that followed, one thing was undeniable. No secret, no matter how deeply buried, could stay hidden forever. The click of handcuffs echoed through the quiet office as they locked around Ethan's wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. He said nothing. The fight drained from him as the weight of his choices settled like a stone in his chest. There was no more running, no more lying. The truth had caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to hide. Agents led him out of the office, past the deputies who had once admired him, past the desks where he had commanded respect. Now they looked at him not as their sheriff, but as a man who had betrayed everything the badge stood for. Whispers followed him down the hall, the judgment heavy in every glance. As the agents escorted Ethan to the waiting car, the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh light on his reckoning. The truth, once buried beneath lies and manipulation, had surfaced. And with it, Ethan Carter's life as he knew it was over. The man who had once served justice was now bound by the same system he had controlled, a prisoner of his own sins. As the car doors slammed shut, the message was unmistakable. No one, not even the sheriff, is above the law. Grief alone is unbearable, but the full weight of a tragedy brings a pain few can comprehend. When detectives recovered Rachel Andrews' body, the nightmare deepened with every new revelation. It wasn't just the betrayal of trust, the unspeakable murder, or the loss of a young life. The autopsy revealed a devastating truth that shattered what little remained of her family's world. Rachel had been in the early stages of pregnancy. The child she carried, Ethan Carter's child, had been growing inside her when her life was violently taken. This discovery turned the grief of her parents, Daniel and Linda Andrews, into something almost unendurable. They weren't just mourning their daughter, they were mourning the grandchild they would never meet. It was a loss wrapped in betrayal, violation, and broken dreams. Daniel could barely process the news. His hands shook as detectives told him about the pregnancy. The knowledge that his daughter had carried a child, only to be silenced by a man he trusted, was more than he could bear. A man who had sat at his table, offering comfort while leading the search astray. The weight of that betrayal pressed on Daniel's chest, suffocating him with guilt. How had he missed the signs? How could he have stood beside Ethan searching for his daughter, while the man responsible misled him at every turn? Linda, already crushed by grief, descended further into despair. That child would have been her first grandchild, a symbol of hope and new beginnings. Now, both Rachel and her unborn baby were gone, buried under a web of lies and deception. There were no words that could ease such pain. Every dream Linda had for Rachel's future had been erased in the cruelest way imaginable. News of the pregnancy spread quickly, turning an already unthinkable crime into something even darker. Ethan Carter wasn't just a murderer. He was a predator who had exploited his power, manipulated a young girl, and taken 2 lives to protect his secrets. The man who had once been a symbol of safety and trust became the embodiment of betrayal. Protesters gathered outside the sheriff's office and courthouse. Their voices filled the streets, demanding justice for Rachel and her baby. Signs declaring justice for Rachel and baby waved in the air while the cries for Ethan's conviction grew louder by the day. The community, once proud of their sheriff, now saw him as a monster in uniform. Every commendation, every kind gesture became a bitter reminder of the evil he had hidden beneath his badge. In the Carter household, the revelations were equally devastating. Charlotte Carter sat in stunned silence as the truth unfolded, her world collapsing under the weight of her husband's lies. The affair had blindsided her, the murder had shattered her, but the pregnancy, that was the final blow, a truth she couldn't comprehend. She replayed every moment she had shared with Ethan, every day he had spent with their daughters, knowing now that he carried this secret the entire time. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the knowledge that her husband had fathered a child with Rachel, a girl they had watched grow up, Sophie's best friend. The cruelty of it left her speechless. Sophie Carter, Ethan's youngest daughter and Rachel's best friend, was utterly broken by the news. She had spent weeks grieving Rachel, trying to make sense of her father's involvement. But the pregnancy was too much. Rachel had been carrying Sophie's half-sibling. Now both were gone, taken by the man she once called Dad. The betrayal was too profound to process. Sophie withdrew completely, shutting out the world. She refused to speak to her father, wouldn't even look at him. Every cherished memory, every moment they had shared was tainted by what he had done. Harper, Ethan's older daughter, responded with anger. She had always looked up to her father as a role model, only to discover he was capable of unimaginable cruelty. The pregnancy was the breaking point. Harper packed her belongings and left, cutting all ties with her father, unable to forgive him for the lives he destroyed. The Carter home, once filled with warmth and routine, became a war zone of silence and grief. Charlotte tried to hold her daughters together, but the damage was irreversible. Their family was fractured, broken under the weight of Ethan's betrayal. The trial of Ethan Carter became the event of the decade in the small, devastated town. It wasn't just a courtroom drama, it was a reckoning. The entire community watched as the man who had once been their protector sat shackled in a defendant's chair, his head bowed under the weight of his crimes. From the first day, the courtroom was packed. Spectators, journalists, and townsfolk filled the benches, their eyes fixed on the man who had betrayed them all. Outside, protesters gathered daily, their chants demanding justice echoing through the courthouse walls. The prosecution built their case meticulously, piece by piece, each revelation driving another nail into Ethan's coffin. They presented the forensic evidence, the shallow grave, the vial bearing Ethan's fingerprint, and the autopsy findings confirming Rachel's pregnancy. They walked the jury through GPS data from Ethan's truck, directly linking him to the burial site. And then came the surveillance footage from the gas station showing Ethan with Rachel in her final hours. Every detail painted a chilling picture of premeditation, manipulation, and cold-blooded murder. As the evidence piled up, Ethan's defense team struggled to mount a credible argument. Their attempts to portray him as a man overwhelmed by circumstance crumbled in the face of the overwhelming facts. But the trial's most powerful moments came not from the evidence, but from the voices of those Ethan had betrayed. Rachel's father, Daniel Andrews, was the first to take the stand. His testimony was raw and devastating. He spoke of Rachel's dreams, her bright future, and the trust he had placed in Ethan, a trust that had been shattered in the worst possible way. His voice broke as he described the moment he learned of her death and realized his closest friend had taken her life. "I trusted him," Daniel said, his voice trembling with grief and anger. "I trusted him with my family, with my daughter, and he destroyed her." Next came Linda Andrews, Rachel's mother. Her testimony was quieter but no less powerful. She spoke of the hole Rachel's death had left in their family, of endless nights spent crying for the daughter and grandchild she would never hold. "She was my baby," Linda said through tears, "and he took her from me. He took everything." But it was Charlotte Carter's testimony that shook the courtroom to its core. The wife of the accused, the woman who had shared a life and a home with him, now stood as a witness for the prosecution. Charlotte spoke of the betrayal she had endured, the lies she had uncovered, and the devastation Ethan's actions had wrought on their family. "He destroyed our family," Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "He destroyed everything we built together, and he did it without a second thought." Sophie and Harper, Ethan's daughters, also testified, their words filled with anger and heartbreak. They spoke of their love for Rachel, their disbelief at their father's actions, and the pain of knowing the man they once idolized had committed such horrific crimes. "He wasn't just my dad," Sophie said, her voice shaking. "He was supposed to protect us, to protect her. But he didn't. He betrayed us all." The prosecution's closing statement was brief but devastating, summarizing the mountain of evidence and the irreparable harm Ethan had caused. "This was not a moment of weakness," the prosecutor said, turning to the jury. "This was a calculated, premeditated act of betrayal and murder. Ethan Carter used his position of power to manipulate and exploit a young girl. When the consequences threatened his life, he chose to end hers. He chose to take not one but two lives to protect his secrets. And now it's time for him to face justice." The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned to the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Ethan sat motionless as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Carter, guilty of all charges." The words echoed through the courtroom, a collective exhale filling the space as justice was finally served. The judge's sentence was swift and unforgiving. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ethan Carter, the once respected sheriff, was led from the courtroom in shackles, his head bowed under the crushing weight of his guilt. Outside, the town gathered in the streets, their voices a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but the scars Ethan left behind would never fully heal. Rachel Andrews and her unborn child were gone, their lives stolen in an act of unimaginable cruelty. Yet in their absence, the community vowed to keep their memories alive. As the sun set on the day of Ethan's sentencing, the town began the long and painful process of healing, knowing that while justice had been delivered, the wounds of betrayal and loss would linger for years to come.
Hey, before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join our amazing community and stay connected with fresh content every single day. It's free, it's easy, and it guarantees you'll never miss out on the stories, insights, and adventures we share. So go ahead, click subscribe, and let's make every day unforgettable together.